Walk down to the shoreline of the Salton Sea in California today, and the first thing you notice is that the beach is not made of sand. It crunches under your feet, pale and brittle and strange, and when you look down, you realize what you are standing on. Bones, fish bones, millions upon millions of them, the skeletal remains of fish that died here, bleached white by the desert sun, packed together into a beach of the dead that stretches for miles. The air carries a smell, a low, sulfurous, rotten egg stench that on a bad day can travel 150 miles and be smelled in the city of Los Angeles. Out on the cracked flats stand the ruins, a collapsed yacht club, the skeletons of motels, empty roads with cheerful street signs, Seaview Drive, Desert Beach Drive, pointing toward vacation homes that were never finished, or were finished and then drowned, or finished and then simply abandoned to the salt and the wind. It looks like the end of the world, and it is one of the strangest, saddest places in all of America. Because here is what you would never guess, standing on that beach of bones. 60 years ago, this was paradise. This was the hottest desert resort in California, a glittering Riviera where Frank Sinatra came to play, where the Beach Boys performed, where Bing Crosby and the Marx Brothers and Desi Arnaz vacationed. At its peak, this place drew 1.5 million visitors a year, more than Yosemite National Park. They came to water ski on the shimmering blue water, to race speedboats, to fish, to drink cocktails at the largest marina in Southern California. They called it the miracle in the desert, the Salton Riviera, a new Palm Springs, but with water. And every single one of those tourists sunning themselves on the shore was partying on top of a slow-motion catastrophe that had been baked into this place from the very first day, because the Salton Sea should not exist at all. It was not supposed to be here. It is here because of a mistake, one of the greatest engineering blunders in American history. And from the moment that mistake filled this desert basin with water, the water was doomed. It was poisoning itself the entire time the tourists were laughing in the sun. This is the story of the Salton Sea, and it is a different kind of fall than almost any other, because there is no villain in it, no mob, no crooked developer. You can fully blame no single greedy hand. There is only human hubris in the patient, indifferent chemistry of the desert, and a paradise that was a lie from the beginning. To understand how a resort where Sinatra sang became a beach made of bones, you have to go back to 1905 and to a river that got loose. At the turn of the 20th century, the great dream in Southern California was to make the desert bloom. The Imperial Valley in the far southeastern corner of the state was some of the most sun-baked, barren land in the country. But the soil, everyone understood, was fantastically fertile. All it needed was water, and the water was right there, sort of. The mighty Colorado River ran nearby, so a company called the California Development Company set out to do something audacious, to dig irrigation canals that would divert the Colorado River into the Imperial Valley and turn the desert into farmland. And it worked at first spectacularly. By 1904, more than 100,000 acres of desert had been reclaimed and were growing crops. It looked like a miracle of engineering. But there was a problem. The main canal kept getting clogged with silt from the muddy Colorado, and the men running the company grew impatient. So to keep the water flowing, they made a fateful decision. They cut a new channel, a temporary bypass, south of the clog to route the river water around the blockage. And in their haste, they did not build proper headgates. Headgates are the crucial structures that control how much water flows through a channel. The throttle, the brakes, the thing that lets you shut the flow off if you need to. The engineers meant the bypass to be temporary, used for just a few months, so they skipped the expensive headgates. That was the mistake. That was the whole catastrophe right there, because in the spring of 1905, the Colorado River flooded. Heavy rains and snow melt up in the Rocky Mountains sent a massive surge of water down the river, and that surge hit the temporary bypass channel with no headgates to stop. Idiot! The rushing water tore the channel wider and deeper and wider still until the entire Colorado River abandoned its natural course and poured unchecked, uncontrolled into the Salton Sink, an ancient dry lake bed sitting more than 200 feet below sea level in the middle of the desert, and it did not stop. For nearly 2 years, 18 months and more, the full flow of one of the great rivers of North America emptied itself into the desert. It wiped out farms and rail lines and an entire valley community. The Southern Pacific Railroad, which had rail interests all over the region, was finally forced to intervene in a desperate, frantic engineering battle to close the breach, halting rail traffic across California, redirecting thousands of rail cars to the site, and dumping over 3,000 loads of boulders, yachian and rock, gravel, and dirt into the raging gap until, at last, in early 1907, they choked the river back into its proper course. But by then, it was far too late to undo what had happened, because sitting in the desert basin where 2 years earlier there had been nothing but dry, cracked, empty sink, was now a vast inland sea, 35 miles long, 15 miles wide, some 340 square miles of water, the largest lake in the entire state of California, created entirely by accident, by a river that got loose because someone didn't build a gate. They called it the Salton Sea, and from the day it was born, it was already dying. You just couldn't see it yet. Here is the fatal flaw, the poison, at the root of the whole thing. The Salton Sea has no outlet, none. It is what scientists call a terminal or endorheic lake. Water flows in, but no water flows out. There is no river draining it, no channel to the ocean, no way for the water to leave except one, evaporation. And in the brutal heat of the California desert, evaporation is relentless. The sun lifts the pure water off the surface of the lake and carries it away as vapor, but it leaves everything else behind. Every grain of salt, every mineral, every dissolved chemical that flows into the sea stays in the sea, forever concentrating, building up year after year after year. The Salton Sea is, in the coldest scientific terms, a mineral trap, a place where poison checks in and never checks out. And by all rights, that accidental sea should have simply evaporated away within a few years, vanishing back into desert as the ancient lake that had filled that basin before had done many times over the millennia. It would have dried up and disappeared. Except for one thing, the farms. Because remember, the whole reason the canals were dug was to irrigate the Imperial Valley, and that farming boom did not stop. It exploded, and all those thousands of acres of heavily irrigated cropland had to drain their excess water somewhere. And where did it drain? Downhill into the lowest point in the region, into the Salton Sea. So the sea was kept alive, kept full, decade after decade, not by a clean river, but by agricultural runoff, by the water that ran off the farm fields. And that runoff carried with it exactly what you would expect farm runoff to carry: fertilizers, pesticides, and a heavy load of dissolved salts and toxic elements like selenium. The Salton Sea was being kept alive by the very thing that would eventually turn it into poison. The trap was set, and it was baited with the runoff that filled it. But for a while, for one bright, strange, glorious moment in the middle of the 20th century, none of that was visible. For a while, the accident looked like a gift, because in the 1950s, as the nearby desert resort town of Palm Springs was becoming a glamorous playground for Hollywood, developers looked at this enormous, shimmering, improbable blue lake sitting in the middle of the desert, and they saw dollar signs, a sea in the desert, next door to Palm Springs. They could hardly believe their luck, and they moved in to build. Along the shores of the Salton Sea, brand new resort towns rose up out of nothing. On the western shore, Salton City, Salton Sea Beach, desert shores. On the eastern shore, Desert Beach, North Shore, Bombay Beach. Developers like Penn Phillips bought up the land and subdivided it and sold lots to thousands of eager buyers, painting a picture of a desert waterfront paradise. Your own vacation home on the beautiful Salton Riviera, they dredged marinas, they built hotels and restaurants and motels. To make the fishing spectacular, the state's Department of Fish and Game stocked the sea with hardy salt-tolerant sport fish, corvina, croaker, sargo, and for a couple of decades, the fishing was genuinely fantastic. The lake teeming with fish, a real sport fishery, drawing anglers from everywhere. And the crown jewel of it all opened in 1959. The North Shore Beach and Yacht Club, the largest marina in all of Southern California, a sleek, modernist temple to leisure on the water. This was the golden age. They marketed the Salton Sea as the miracle in the desert, and America believed it. At its absolute height, the Salton Sea drew around 1.5 million visitors every single year, more in some years than Yosemite National Park. Think about that. A lake that had been created by a plumbing accident 50 years earlier was now outdrawing one of the most beloved natural wonders in the country. And the stars came. Frank Sinatra came to the Salton Sea. Bing Crosby. The Beach Boys performed here. Jerry Lewis, the Marx Brothers, Desi Arnaz, Rock Hudson, the glittering celebrity culture of mid-century California, spilled out of Palm Springs and onto the shores of this desert sea. There were beauty pageants and yacht parties and cocktails at sunset. It was, for that shining moment, one of the most fashionable vacation spots in America. There was even one genuinely wondrous thing about the Salton Sea, a gift of the very flaw that would eventually kill it. Because the sea sat more than 200 feet below sea level, and because its water was growing saltier and therefore denser than normal, boats floated higher and moved faster across its surface than they could almost anywhere else on Earth. The Salton Sea became a mecca for speedboat racing. Racers came here specifically to chase world records, and they shattered them. At one regatta, drivers set 21 world speed records in a single event, to the delight of enormous crowds lining the shore. The dense, salty, below sea level water made the boats fly. It was magic. It was also, though no one wanted to think about it, a symptom. The very saltiness that made the boats race faster was the poison, slowly rising. Because all through the Golden Age, the countdown was ticking, and a few people knew it. As early as the beginning of the 1960s, at the very height of the boom, while Sinatra was singing and the speedboats were flying, the California Department of Fish and Game did the math on the sea's rising salinity and issued a quiet, chilling prediction. This sea, they warned, was going to die. The salt was climbing, and it would keep climbing because there was no outlet, and eventually it would climb past the point where anything could live in the water. They predicted the Salton Sea would become biologically dead somewhere around 1980 or 1990. Nobody wanted to hear it. The tourists kept coming. The developers kept selling lots. The party rolled on whimsically, willfully blind to the doom that the chemistry had guaranteed from the very first day. They were dancing on the deck of a ship that everyone qualified to read the instruments knew was slowly sinking. And then, in the 1970s, the sinking became impossible to ignore. It started with the fish. As the salinity climbed higher and higher, the water growing saltier than the ocean, and then far saltier still, the fish that had been stocked to create that wonderful fishery began to reach their limit, and the agricultural runoff pouring in made it worse. All those fertilizers fed enormous blooms of algae, and when the algae died and decomposed, they sucked the oxygen out of the water, salt on one side, suffocation on the other, and the fish began to die. Not a few fish, millions of fish, all at once in catastrophic die-offs, great floating rafts of dead fish that washed up and rotted on the beaches, layer upon layer, year after year. until the shoreline itself was built from their bones. The beach of the dead that you can walk on today was assembled one mass die-off at a time, and with the rotting fish came the smell. The decomposition, combined with hydrogen sulfide gas rising from the increasingly foul lake, produced a stench that the U.S. Geological Survey itself has described in unusually vivid official language as objectionable, noxious, and pervasive. On bad days, when the wind was wrong, that rotten egg reek didn't just hang over the beaches. It was rolled outward across the desert. In one notorious episode in 2012, a storm churned up the lake and sent the smell drifting all the way to the Los Angeles basin, 150 miles away, prompting thousands of confused, gagging phone calls to authorities across Southern California. And then the water itself turned on the towns, because the Salton Sea in the late 1970s did the opposite of what everyone feared. For a moment it rose. A series of powerful tropical storms, including Hurricane Kathleen in 1976, dumped enormous amounts of rain and flooded the Imperial Valley, and all that water drained, as always, into the terminal sea with nowhere to go. The lake level climbed and spilled over its banks, and it flooded the low-lying resort towns that had been so cheerfully built right at the water's edge. Bombay Beach and the other communities were inundated. Homes, streets, businesses, marinas swamped, many of them ruined beyond repair. The developers who were still building simply walked away, abandoning half-finished subdivisions, leaving behind a ghostly grid of empty paved roads, sewer lines that led nowhere, and jaunty street signs standing in the salt, pointing the way to a paradise that would never be completed. That was the end of the dream. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the tourists stopped coming. Who would vacation at a lake that smelled of death and was carpeted with rotting fish? The hotels closed, the restaurants closed, the magnificent North Shore Yacht Club fell silent and empty, and the birds, which had flocked to the Salton Sea by the millions, for it sits on the Pacific Flyway, a crucial migratory rest stop, began to die too, poisoned by botulism as they fed on the dying fish. Great die-offs of pelicans and other birds adding their bodies to the catastrophe. The resort towns emptied out and shriveled into salt-crusted ghost towns. What had been billed as the miracle in the desert became, in the words that now attach to it, an ecological nightmare, a post-apocalyptic hellscape. The Salton Sea died, more or less exactly on the schedule the scientists had predicted 20 years before, while everyone was still dancing. And here is where the story should end, with the ruins and the fish bones and the silence. Another dead paradise. But the Salton Sea is not finished killing, because its most dangerous chapter is happening right now. Because remember what the sea is: a terminal lake, a mineral trap that for over a century has been collecting every toxic thing that washed into it. 100 years of agricultural runoff, pesticides, fertilizers, selenium, arsenic, all of it concentrated and trapped in that water and settled into the mud of the lake bed with no outlet, nowhere to go. For all those decades, the water itself was the one thing keeping that poison contained, holding it down, sealing it under the surface, and now the water is disappearing. After the year 2000, and especially after a major 2003 agreement in which the Imperial Valley agreed to send more of its Colorado River water to the thirsty coastal cities like San Diego, far less runoff has been flowing into the Salton Sea. And so the sea, no longer replenished, has begun to do what it always would have done without the farms. It has begun to shrink, to evaporate, to retreat. And as it retreats, it exposes something horrifying. The playa, the dry lake bed, coated in a century's worth of accumulated toxic chemicals, drying out and turning to fine light dust in the desert sun. And the desert wind picks that dust up, and it carries it into the lungs of the people who live around the Salton Sea. Those people are, for the most part, poor, rural, largely Latino farm worker communities. The towns of the Imperial and Coachella valleys. And they are now living inside one of the worst air quality crises in America. The rate of childhood asthma around the Salton Sea runs about 3 times the California state average, among the worst in the entire state. The exposed lakebed dust carries selenium and arsenic linked to cardiovascular disease, neurological damage, and worse. The director of the Audubon Society's Salton Sea program called the situation, without exaggeration, the worst environmental, health, and economic crisis in modern history. And it is getting worse as the sea keeps shrinking, with scientists warning it has the potential to become one of the worst air quality disasters on the planet. Sit with the full, terrible circularity of it. A mistake in 1905 created a sea that should never have existed. That sea was sold as a miracle and a paradise, while it quietly poisoned itself for 50 years. It died into a rotting, stinking apocalypse. And now, in death, as it dries up and turns to dust, it is reaching out and poisoning the living, sickening the children of the poor families who happen to live on the shores of a 100-year-old accident. The mistake is still killing. The Dead Sea is still claiming victims. There has never been anything else quite like it. So what becomes of a place like this? Strangely, improbably, the Salton Sea has not been entirely abandoned to the dust. In the ruins of Bombay Beach, that flooded, forsaken resort town, something unexpected has grown. Since around 2011, artists have descended on the wreckage and transformed it into one of the most surreal art destinations in the country. An annual gathering called the Bombay Beach Biennale, where installations rise out of the salt and the abandoned buildings, beauty blooming in the apocalypse. Nearby sits Slab City, the off-grid squatter community that calls itself the last free place in America, and Salvation Mountain, a hillside painted in every color by a man who spent decades on it. The Dead Sea has become a pilgrimage site for the strange and the searching. And there may yet be one more turn, because deep beneath the Salton Sea, in the hot geothermal brine under that basin, lies one of the largest deposits of lithium in the world. The metal that powers the batteries of electric cars and phones and the whole clean energy future. They are already calling it Lithium Valley. And there are those who believe the Salton Sea's next chapter could be a lithium boom that finally brings wealth back to this poisoned corner of the desert. And the state of California, decades late, is finally spending money, hundreds of millions of dollars, trying to manage the dust and rebuild wetlands and slow the dying. Whether any of it will be enough, no one yet knows. But stand on that beach of bones at sunset, with the strange, terrible, beautiful ruins around you, and the toxic dust blowing off the retreating shore, and you can feel the whole impossible arc of the thing. A river got loose because someone didn't build a gate. An accidental sea filled a dead basin in the desert. Men called it a miracle and sold it as a paradise, and brought Frank Sinatra out to sing on its shores, and for a few glittering years it was the most fashionable place in California, and none of them wanted to hear that the water was already poisoning itself, that the chemistry had doomed it from the very first day. They danced until the fish rotted on the beaches, and the smell reached Los Angeles, and the water rose up and drowned their vacation homes. And now, 100 years after the accident that made it, the Dead Sea exhales its poison onto the children of the living. It was never supposed to be here, and it was never going to last. The miracle in the desert was a mistake all along, the most beautiful, the most tragic, the most toxic mistake in the history of California, and it is still, even now, refusing to quietly go away.